So today, December 19, but 2018, we have our speaker who's going to talk to us about 12 steps to evaluate supplement. And I have here with us Dr. Islon Woolf, who, going through his history as well, he had a biology in physics at University of Toronto, Bachelor in Science. He did his med school also at University of Toronto. He did internal medicine internship at University of Southern California. His internal medicine residency at Mayo Graduate School of Medicine, and he was a chief resident as well, and the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. And he's currently a concierge doctor in internal medicine here at Miami Beach. He's gonna talk to us about supplement and how can we approach when we see one. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Great. Good afternoon. First of all, I'm really impressed with Jorge, how he has taken an interest in the history of medicine. It's a personal thing that I love to read about myself. You know, as people have been quoted, you can't understand your future if you don't know your past. I think it's very important to understand the history of medicine. In fact, today in this lecture, I'm going to be talking a little bit of history of medicine. So, thank you for inviting me to Grand Rounds at Mount Sinai. It is a pleasure. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about supplements. And over the years, I've evaluated for my patients thousands of supplements. And I've tried to develop a methodology in which to evaluate the supplements, whether they are safe and effective. And it turns out that my methodology has 12 steps to it, so I jokingly call this supplements a 12-step program. These are my disclosures. Nothing. I have nothing to disclose. So let's start off with a case. This is a real case that happened in my office, in my practice. I had a gentleman in his 30s, very healthy guy who exercises a lot. I review his medications and supplements for his annual checkup, and he says he's been taking this Infladox now for 6 months. And I asked him, where did he get it from? So he said that his chiropractor sold it to him, and for the purpose of supporting his joints and for exercise recovery. So I wanted to try help him to determine whether he should continue this supplement. So you look at the back label. What's in the supplement? Well, this is what's in the supplement. This is a little bit, didn't really help me very much. It actually made things more complicated. There's actually 7 separate ingredients here, including curcumin, white willow bark, etc. You may see on the top it says 725 milligrams. This is the total milligrams of all of the supplements. Notice how you don't see milligram strength for any of the individual supplements. Do you see that? Because you're not required by law to do that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Anyway, are any of you here, given this, given the indication, given the patient, are you able to render some advice to him whether he should continue this? Yes or no? Don't know? Yeah, I don't know either. So let's go on, and I'm going to show you a way to try and evaluate and help your patients sort through all of this. But first, we need to talk a little bit, give you a little background of supplements. Really, this whole problem with supplements started with a war between the FDA and the supplement industry in the 80s and 90s. The FDA realized that supplements, which are agents from nature, have an incredible potential. Just look at penicillin. This came from nature. But the FDA realized that these things need to be scientifically proven for their effectiveness, and also that they have bad side effects, all of them, including penicillin. The supplement industry didn't want this. Obviously, if there was regulation and you had to provide scientific evidence that this worked and it was safe, the supplement industry would lose their ability to manufacture and sell many of its supplements. The supplement industry won. This is in 1994, the DSHEA Act, Drugs Supplementary Health and Education Act. Basically what this act says is that supplements are not medicines. They should be treated and are foods. Therefore, there's no need to provide safety or effectiveness data. The trade-off, however, was that you can't make any specific disease claims. So you can't say my supplement prevents arthritis. You could say something a little vaguer like it supports joints. I don't know what that means exactly. But anyway, now there's only 27 FDA employees looking at the entire supplement industry to make sure that they are following these rules. This puts us in a caveat emptor, or buyer beware market for supplements. As an example, if you look at quality control studies, 50% of supplements randomly taken off of shelves don't have a single ingredient that was listed on the label. So because of this unregulation, you have 87,000 supplements right now in the United States, and a market that's about $40 billion a year. All of them claim to be effective. All of them claim to treat anywhere between tens and hundreds of diseases. All of them claim to be safe. All of them claim to be supported by scientific evidence. Now, hopefully, your critical thinking is engaged right now because this sounds too good to be true. And anything that sounds too good to be true probably is. Fortunately, all of you were gifted with critical thinking skills that you got through medical school. And I'm going to review 4 of them, these critical thinking skills, that we're going to use to create our 12 steps. The first is your understanding of physiology. Look at pharmaceuticals. Only a small number of candidate drugs end up becoming effective. Most of them are ineffective. You're just seeing the tip of the iceberg in the drugs that you guys are prescribing. All of the drugs that you prescribe have side effects. Every single one of them. All of them work. They have a mechanism of action. There's a biochemical target, either some sort of pathway or a receptor. And all of them have a limited physiologic range of diseases they can treat. I mean, think of insulin. You can only use it for diabetes and type 1, really. Can you use it for anything else? Does it cure cancer? No. And if you look at a survey of all the things that us doctors prescribe, 50% are derived from nature. 50% of what you guys are prescribing originally have a natural source. So this begs the question, how are supplements different from pharmaceuticals? Is there a false dichotomy here? So the dichotomy is supplements are different than pharmaceuticals. Is that really true? Evidence-based medicine, that's another tool that we have. Supplements claim to be backed by scientific evidence. The few supplements that have been subjected to rigorous clinical trials have all failed. As another example, 20% of drug-induced liver injury, or DILI, is caused by supplements. So this begs a question. What do they consider scientific evidence? What are their standards of evidence? Very important for us to determine this. When a supplement seller or a supplement proponent proposes a supplement, what are their standards of evidence? Are they the same as yours? Targeting, this is another tool we have. When there's a lot of noise and we're overwhelmed by things, we use a targeting approach. In supplements, this is very important because, as you saw from Infladox, many ingredients. So you should just look at one ingredient at a time. There's many claims. Just look at one claim at a time. Find all the evidence you can for that one claim and evaluate that to the fullest. That way you can reveal the standard of evidence. It's a very important thing, targeting. And my 12 steps rely heavily on targeting. And systematic. What is a systematic approach? All it means is be fair. Give an equal opportunity to every supplement. Start from scratch. Agree upon a standard of evidence, and then evaluate each supplement using that same standard. That's what a systematic approach means. Good. So now we're going to go through the 12 steps. I'm going to go through them very quickly first, and then we'll go through each one of them in detail. The first 4 steps are all about targeting. Single out one ingredient. Single out one claim. Single out a testable claim. Single out a patient group that's going to benefit from the supplement. Step 5 to 8 is about evidence. So the supplement proponent or the seller is going to be giving you evidence, and you need to organize this evidence. First thing, disregard pseudo-evidence, verify the evidence, ensure the evidence is complete, and put the evidence into different types. And finally, step 9 through 12 is about evaluating the evidence. Number 1, avoid ubiquitous evidence. 2, use evidence that falsifies. Consider analogs, and lastly, your final appraisal. Great. So let's go through each one of these steps in detail. First step, single out one ingredient. As you saw with Infladox, supplements are very commonly found with multiple ingredients. I'm sure some of you have seen supplements that have 20 or 30 different ingredients. Why is this? Well, one of the reasons is branding. Say I'm a cardiologist and I want to give you CoQ10 for your heart. Well, as a patient, you say, well, I'm just going to buy that on Amazon. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few other little things, such as maybe garlic, which can lower your cholesterol a little bit, and some antioxidants. And then I'm going to sell you Dr. Wolf's heart formula. Now you're going to be more tempted to buy that. So also, what I'm doing is I'm disguising the fact that I'm just giving you the same old supplements that everyone else uses it by rebranding it. The other issue why I use multiple ingredients is because of the regulation issues, which I showed you there with Infladox. If you put multiple ingredients, you don't have to put the milligrams of each ingredient. So say you have one of those 7 ingredients is very expensive, right? You can put trace amounts of that, or not at all in a lot of cases, but you can put trace amounts of that, which will save you money. The other problem here is evidence. So we barely have evidence that single ingredients, supplements work. We barely have studies on that. Imagine a supplement that has 20 different ingredients together. It hasn't been specifically tested. Therefore, anything you see from one of these multi-ingredient bottles is purely speculative. It's extrapolated data completely. The one thing I also like to run home to my patients is the fact that there's a double standard here. What if I prescribed you, the patient, a healthy patient, 7 medicines for exercise recovery and joint support, and they went to Walgreens and they found these 7 huge package inserts with all the side effects? Rightfully, they would call me up and say, Dr. Wolf, I'm not certain about this, but if their chiropractor sells it to them, they've got no problem taking it. So I can see a strange double standard here, which I don't really understand, and I point out to them. So each ingredient equals a separate supplement, and evaluate each ingredient to its fullest. Step number 2, single out one claim. So let's take a look at curcumin. Curcumin's a very popular supplement these days. Curcumin claims to treat many, many, many diseases that are physiologically completely different. Curcumin claims to treat cancer. It claims to treat autoimmune disease by decreasing the inflammatory cascade. It claims to treat non-autoimmune arthritis and just osteoarthritis. It claims to boost your immunity and treat infections, and it claims to treat general complaints such as depression and abdominal discomfort. So what is it that I'm going to ask you guys a question. What is it that we call a treatment that treats all or almost every disease? What's that called? We have a term for it. Someone said a panacea. Panacea is correct, not magic bullet. Magic bullet gets to treat a disease without destroying other things as collateral damage. So it's a panacea. Where does the word panacea come from? What? A Greek word, that's correct. Any? No? So Panacea was the daughter of Asclepius. Asclepius is the Greek god of medicine, the one that's depicted with the sword, a snake wrapped around a sword. So he had a few daughters. One of them was Hygeia, where we get the word hygiene, and the other one was Panacea. She was the goddess of the universal treatment, one treatment for all disease. But we know now that, unlike the Greeks, we know this is physiologically unrealistic. Look at the greatest treatments of the 20th century: insulin, statins, penicillin. None of them are able to treat many, many, many diseases. They really have a restricted range of physiology that they're able to treat, because our bodies are complex. There's many, many, many systems, and when you put one system into imbalance, there's a whole cascade of effects, some of them good, some of them bad. That's how physiology works. That's how we understand it now. So beware of panaceas. An idea that explains everything likely explains nothing. Now, suppose it was true. Suppose I did have a panacea that worked for everything. I still would be required to prove each one of its claims one by one. Take a look at aspirin. Aspirin is a medicine that has many, many different treatments, claims. each one of them has taken billions of dollars, decades and decades, and we still don't know what to do with it. Most of you know about the new study on aspirin, that when given to healthy 70 and 80-year-olds, there was more bleeding events than prevention of heart disease, right? Now, supplements, on the other hand, are underfunded and understudied. So what can be said of a supplement making hundreds of disease claims? Well, to me, it says either the proponents have a gross misunderstanding of physiology, they're fraudulent, or they have a low standard of evidence. So evaluating one claim helps you reveal their standard of evidence. So look at one claim in detail. Step number 3, single out a testable claim. So as I mentioned before, the Deshay laws end up forcing vague claims because they're not allowed to make specific claims. So you'll see something like this. CoQ10 supports heart health. Well, this is a vague, untestable claim. Why? Well, you have the word support, which is a very weak word, and then you have the word heart health. What's heart health? Well, heart health could mean exercise performance. It could mean the pumping of your heart, the ejection fraction, or preventing heart failure. It could mean the electrical system of your heart, such as atrial fibrillation. It could mean the coronary arteries. It means so many things, it really means nothing. It's an untestable claim. Now, if you want to get ultimately vague, ask your patients while they're taking the CoQ10, it's good for me. Now here is a testable claim. CoQ10 prevents heart attacks. You have a solid word, prevents, and you have heart attacks, which is a specific disease. You can count the events. You can imagine a clinical trial where you take thousands of people, half of them get CoQ10, the other half don't, and count the heart attacks. That's a testable claim. That's what you should be looking for. So the take-home message here is an idea must be distinct before reason can act upon it. Single out a testable claim. 4th step in targeting, single out a patient group. As we know, some patients benefit from medicines more than other people. You know, we have risk groups. What's interesting in supplements is what's known as the inverse law of supplements. And the inverse law of supplements is this. People who take supplements are the least likely to need it. Think about it. Who are the most likely to take supplements? According to surveys, white, healthy, wealthy, middle-aged females. Who are the least in need of particularly nutritional supplementation is that group. They have the best lifestyle, they have the best healthcare, they have the best of everything. So they're going to have the worst benefit to risk ratio. They're going to likely have small benefits, and then the side effects, even if they're rare, become important. This is really well exemplified with aspirin and bisphosphonates. When we start to use these medicines in a low-risk population, the rare side effects start to become very important. Okay, so now we have a single ingredient, a single claim, and a group that we want to use this supplement on. Now we want to look at the evidence. So you're going to be presented evidence by either the supplement proponent, the supplement company, or Dr. Oz, or somebody's blog, or whoever it is. So the first thing you need to do is disregard pseudo-evidence. So what is pseudo-evidence? Well, without evidence, as I mentioned, supplements really don't have many studies. So if you don't have evidence, sellers then turn to distraction. Let me give you a few of the strategies. One of the strategies is to put down the competition. And it goes something like this. Big Pharma. Big Pharma is for profit. It does unethical things. Therefore, we have the cure to cancer. Now, hopefully, you can see this is a non sequitur, that even if the premises are true, Big Pharma is unethical, which it is, and they do unethical things for sure, it still doesn't mean you have the cure for cancer. In fact, I see this as the opposite. Think about it. If Big Pharma, which is for profit and highly regulated, is able to do unethical things, imagine how unethical the nutraceutical or the supplement companies are, because they're for profit and unregulated. The next tactic you'll see of distraction is to give you a whole bunch of irrelevant and technical details, such as we use different strains of the plant, slow We have a slow release formulation. Our quality control is good, et cetera, all of the while never proving that the supplement works in the first place. So disregard pseudo-evidence. Conspiracy theory and technobabble are no substitute for evidence. All right, number 6, verify evidence. As I said, this is a buyer beware market. You have to verify the evidence. So if you see a claim, curcumin treats arthritis in animal studies, you have to follow that. You have to go on PubMed and find that. Now, just say it's referenced, which sometimes it may be. You need to follow that reference and then see if it's actually published. Kid you not, I was once referred to a high school science project as evidence. And then, even if it is published, make sure it's in a peer-reviewed journal. All of you here know that for $700, I can publish any article I want in an open access journal. And then make sure it's relevant. So in other words, does the article actually talk about curcumin, arthritis, and animal studies? And I can't tell you how many times I've been referred to articles that had nothing to do with this. So it is your responsibility to verify this. That's why you can't do this with 100 claims. You can only do it with one claim. It's going to take a lot of work just to go over one claim. All right, number 7, ensure the evidence is complete. There already may be out there evidence that disconfirms your supplement, that it doesn't work already. But this is not going to be volunteered by the people promoting the supplement. Why? Because they don't have to. Great example for this is prostate formulas. So prostate formulas often contain saw palmetto, selenium, and vitamin E because at one point there was some preliminary data that showed that these things helped. But subsequent studies, for instance in saw palmetto, if you look at meta-analyses, it doesn't work for prostate symptoms. From the SELECT trial of 27,000 patients, randomized controlled trial by the NIH, selenium doesn't prevent prostate cancer, and if anything, increases your risk for diabetes, and vitamin E increases prostate cancer by 17%. Let me say that again. Vitamin E increases prostate by 17% in a randomized controlled trial with 27,000 patients. If this were a pharmaceutical, it would be taken off the market. The last thing in organizing your evidence is to type evidence. Now, from my experience with supplements, I would say that there's about 6 different types of evidence that are used for supplements. I'm going to review each one of them. You all know this, but I think it's important to review. The first is anecdotal evidence. So this would sound like, oh, my friend so-and-so started taking Infladox and then his back pain got better. This form of evidence, anecdotal evidence, is really historically our oldest form of evidence. It dates back tens of thousands of years if you really think about it. And as social animals, we find stories very compelling from our fellow in fact, as Stalin said, 1 death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. Hopefully a lot of you know that quote. The next form of evidence is ancient wisdom. And this would sound like this traditional Chinese herb has been used for 2,000 years. And what this relies on is a survival of the fittest ideas. In other words, how would this herb last for 2,000 years if it didn't work? And also it relies on our perception that the ancients were somehow in touch with nature in a way that we've lost now in our modern world. Next type of evidence is authority. And this is used a lot in supplement advertising. Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling says that vitamin C prevents heart disease and cancer. Laboratory evidence. This would sound like, this is evidence from test tube studies, in vitro studies, in animals. So in the supplement world, this would sound like Denham Harmon in the 1950s started studying the effects of ionizing radiation. And he saw that it produced free radicals. And this caused cancer, and this is what actually causes the damage. He also noticed that just from cellular respiration, just from the Krebs cycle, you're producing tons of free radicals. So to him, he found the cause of aging and senescence of your cells. And if you just buffer these free radicals with antioxidants, you're going to prevent aging, heart disease, etc. That's an example of laboratory evidence. It's very important. It establishes physiology, and it's been very key criteria in science and medical science for the last maybe 8-9 decades. Observational evidence, this is where we survey a population and compare it to another population. So for instance, with the antioxidant hypothesis, well, people who eat fruits and vegetables which are high in antioxidants have less heart disease and cancer than people who don't. And then finally, the clinical trial. And in the clinical trial, what we do is we create two identical groups by randomization. We blind them, and then we expose them to the treatment. And so in this case, one group gets vitamin E, the other group doesn't get vitamin E, and let's count the number of cancers they get. And they'll probably get more prostate cancers if they're a man. Okay, so now step 9 through 12 is really about evaluating this evidence. And step 9 is to avoid ubiquitous evidence. What do I mean by ubiquitous evidence? Well, it's evidence that's easy to find. If you have a claim, you can find that evidence. Easy to find. And all of the first 5 types of evidence that I gave you, anecdotal evidence, ancient wisdom, authority, laboratory evidence, and observational evidence, they all are ubiquitous evidence. And I need to go through each one of them with you to explain why. I have given this lecture before, and people have a lot of problems with this part of the lecture, so that's why I'm spending time on each one. So the first one is anecdotal evidence. This one's the hardest for people to perceive. You can find anecdotal evidence for any claim. You just can. And the reason for this is that we are pattern-seeking creatures. I think a wonderful experiment for this that really demonstrates this is by B.F. Skinner, the famous psychologist who invented the Skinner box. And he did this experiment, which I'm going to show you. There's audio for this, but the audio is not working, where he shows a pigeon where the pigeon gets a treat. You've seen all these types of Skinner experiments. But here, he sets a timer to random. So the pigeon just gets the treat randomly, and it doesn't know what it did to get the treat. So if it was flapping its wings right before it got the treat, it would just sit there flapping its wings and just keep on going because it makes these patterns. So this is the... Oh, there is a little... So that's called pigeon superstition. You can find the YouTube video. It's actually quite charming. The other name for this is called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which basically means if something happens after an event, then it was that preceding event that caused it. This is a classic fallacy. We all make this. So for instance, your friend or your patient takes Infladox and their back pain gets better. Can any of you please tell me other reasons why his back pain got better that had nothing to actually do with the Infladox physiologically? Would you say rest? Yeah, exactly. So right. So the most obvious thing is the natural history of the disease, or a statistical phenomenon we call regression to mean. If you guys are interested in that, we can speak about it after. There's a placebo effect, or something known as the Hawthorne effect. There's concurrent treatments. He may have been taking a bunch of other things but didn't tell you about it. And then there's the fallibility of human memory, that he just may have not remembered the events very well. This list goes down, and this is an entire lecture on itself, what's wrong with anecdotal evidence, but I just wanted to give you some brief examples. Ancient wisdom. You can find ancient wisdom for almost any claim. And the reason is because there's so much ancient wisdom out there. There are so many texts out there. I need to give you a great example for this. So Artemisia, otherwise known as wormwood, was discovered by Tu Yu. She was a traditional Chinese medicine doctor working in China in the 1970s. And Chairman Mao told her, you better find for the Vietnamese soldiers a treatment for malaria because there's a lot of chloroquine resistance here. So she found Artemisia mentioned in a traditional Chinese medicine text, now traditional Chinese medicine didn't know malaria. They didn't have the germ theory of disease, but they had sort of the symptoms of maybe a relapsing fever. So she found wormwood mentioned in it, she tested it, and she won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for finding this. And the medicine's called Coartem, and it's used to save literally millions of lives because it's very cheap in the third world. But what I want you to do is to go a little more deep into the story and into her biography, and you'll see that what happened is she scoured hundreds of traditional Chinese medicine textbooks, and she actually found 5,000 candidate herbs that were mentioned for the treatment of relapsing fever. Each one of them failed. She created an in vitro study. She had a mouse model of malaria and would give them all extracts of these herbs. Every one of them failed except for this one. Now, to me, that's more an indictment of traditional Chinese medicine. When you're wrong 5,000 times and you're right once, that's more random, correct? The other point here is that real cures are rare in nature. A great example of this is the National Cancer Institute had a plant screening program in the 1960s, also an in vitro test to see if these plant extracts had anti-cancer properties. They found one treatment out of 10,000 plants. Does anyone know the one treatment that they found? Okay, I'll give you a clue. It's from the Pacific yew tree. No? Taxol. Very good. Excellent. Yes. Great. So, and then the other point here is that the ancient medical systems are really bad at picking up side effects. And let me show you another wonderful example of this. There is a herb called Aristolochia. Aristolochia is prevalent in both Asia and Europe, and has been used by all the ancient medical systems, Hippocratic, Ayurvedic, and traditional Chinese medicine for millennium. But it wasn't until the 1990s when Aristolochia was used in a Belgian weight loss clinic as a natural treatment for weight loss, and they started to notice that their patients went into renal failure and developed cancer of the ureter. They also, the pathologists looked at the pathology of this and they said, wow, this kind of looks like Balkan nephropathy, which is an idiopathic nephropathy for decades that we had been trying to figure out where is it from. Turns out that Aristolochia is a weed that grows in the fields in the Balkans, the wheat fields, and when they were making bread, they would get a little of aristolochic acid, which is the evil agent, as part of their wheat, and that's how they got it. But your ancient medical system would have never figured this out, since you have never dissected a single human cadaver. Authority, you can find authority for every claim. And why is that? Well, that's what authority figures do. They found one thing in medicine, that's how they become authority. They're driven to find the next big thing. That's what they do. And worse than that, they had their intuition confirmed. So if you had an incredible idea, think about it. When are Nobel Prizes awarded? 20, 30 years afterwards, after the evidence comes and verifies that they were correct. So if you're a Nobel Prize winner, this is going to lead to a sense of overconfidence, and that their confirmation is not required. Any intuition you get has to be right. This is a disease called Nobel disease. And if you take a look this up, it's very interesting. About 50% of Nobel Prize winners, after they win their Nobel Prize, get into the occult and pseudoscience, and they get into really strange things. Laboratory evidence. So you can find, if you want, laboratory evidence for any treatment or claim. Why is this? First of all, laboratory evidence is indirect evidence afterwards. You're not proving that a treatment works in a human. It works either in an animal or on some surrogate model of mechanism or a cell in a test tube. The other big problem with laboratory evidence is oversimplification. I think the best example for this is why the antioxidant hypothesis failed. Well, it turns out that we make our own internal or endogenous antioxidants, which we only found out at Duke University in the 1980s and 1990s. So it turns out that if the free radicals that you produce in your cell, like say from exercise, those signal your cell to produce more internal antioxidants. So if you give yourself vitamins, you're actually dulling that signal, and you don't produce as much of your own internal antioxidants. This is one of the reasons why the antioxidant hypothesis failed. So we oversimplified. We looked at this one cellular process and didn't realize it was much more complicated than we actually thought. The other problem with laboratory evidence is the opposite. Boundless, what I call boundless interconnectivity. Meaning if you look at our achievements in understanding the epigenome, the genome, the microbiome, we're realizing so much more complexity and seeing the human body at so many more complex levels. A great example of this interconnectivity is the gut flora. I challenge anyone here to think of a disease that you can't connect to a gut flora imbalance. You can't, and you've heard almost every field of medicine somehow make a claim and connect it to gut flora. It's easy. Physiologically, it's easy to do. I call this, it's a game, I call it 6 physiological degrees of separation. That in 6 steps or less, you can connect any treatment with any disease. It's very easy to do. And there's a reproducibility problem. So this study was published in Nature. Both Amgen and Bayer were looking for the next blockbuster cancer drug. But they were scouring the basic science literature looking for drug candidates. But before doing multi-billion-dollar trials, they said, you know what, let's replicate some of these basic science experiments first. Amgen was able to replicate 11% of these trials, Bayer 25%. Observational evidence, you can find this for any claim as well. And there's 2 reasons for it. One is data dredging. So data dredging is a concept that even in random noise, if you look at enough variables with a p-value of 0.05, you will find associations. You just will. Statistically, it's an inevitability. The other problem is confounding. Even if it's a true association, association is not causation. Another big fallacy we often make. I think the best example for this is in cardiology. In the 80s and 90s, we saw that all of these things, women who took hormone replacement therapy, vitamin A levels, or people who ate foods high in vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, folic acid, homocysteine, all of these things were strongly, strongly associated with cardiovascular disease. Every single one of them. We did clinical trials on all of them. Every single one of them failed. And why is that? It's because the people who, for instance, have high levels of vitamins and eating fruits and vegetables, they're also prone to other salubrious activities. They may exercise, they don't smoke, et cetera, et cetera. This is confounding. So now I get to step number 10. Step number 10, well, 9 was avoid ubiquitous evidence. 10 is use evidence that falsifies. Because basically, hopefully I've demonstrated to you, it's too easy to find confirmatory evidence for your treatment. Anyone can find evidence that a treatment works. This is a concept that really was developed even before evidence-based medicine was developed in the 1930s by a guy named Karl Popper, a philosopher of science. And it's called science as falsification. If any of you are really interested in science and sort of the history and the philosophy of it, read his paper called Science as Falsification. It's like a 3-page paper. It'll change the way you see science. Let me explain to you what he meant. Let me give you an example with a psychic. So essentially, what does a psychic claim to do? A psychic claims to predict the future, right? Confirmatory evidence of her being able to do this is very easy to find. Very easy to find. And therefore, it's unhelpful. There's anecdote. There's lots and lots of people who testify that a psychic accurately predicted their future. I could assure you there's several people in this room right now who have seen a psychic and claim that they predicted their future well. We won't do a poll, but Ancient wisdom. Well, psychics have been around for thousands of years. How could it not work? It wouldn't have lasted so long. There's authority. Lots of presidents use psychics now when they're in a pickle and they have difficult decisions to make. That's a fact. And you can even find laboratory evidence for psychics. Why? Well, you can use the old Deepak Chopra quantum physics, right? Because in the quantum world, electrons act really strange with respect to time and space. Therefore, this explains how a psychic is able to tell the future. So you got all these types of evidence. None of them really help us. At the end of the day, and this is what Karl Popper would have you do, it doesn't help to try confirm. You want to try falsify her. You want to prove her wrong. And how would you do that? Does anyone have an idea how you would do it? How do you falsify her? You get, what? Yes, oh wow, wonderful, smart guy. Force her to make a risky prediction. Risky prediction. So that's what you do. Here's a risky prediction. What color what color shoes and blouse does Dr. Schaefer, what is she going to wear on May the 21st, 1919? Now, if she predicted that, would you guys be impressed? I certainly would. Would you think that maybe psychics had something? I certainly would. I would be because that's a risky prediction. But what's going to happen? She's going to refuse. She's going to say, I'm not in control of the information the spirit world sends me. It's sort of a one-way street, or whatever she's going to say. But she's going to refuse to be falsified. Have I proven her wrong? No, I haven't proven her wrong. Just unfalsifiable. And unfalsifiability is a measure of the weakness of a theory. A theory should be falsifiable. At least to make it scientific, it should be falsifiable. Let me compare and contrast this to the science that was going around during the time of Karl Popper with physics that he was very impressed with. And I'll show you why he was so impressed with this. So look at the theory of relativity. The theory of relativity is really just mathematical. There's no concrete evidence that it works. But relativity makes some pretty concrete, risky predictions. And one of the predictions you can see from this diagram is that if you have a very large gravitational mass, that it will bend light. So it'll make stars that are near the sun look further away from the sun. But this is a difficult experiment to conduct because you can't see stars near the sun. Why? Because the sun's too bright. Except when? An eclipse. So now you have the famous Eddington expedition where Arthur Eddington in 1919 goes to the island of Principe during a total solar eclipse of the sun. And you can see in this star field, this is what the stars look like without the sun. And then this is what it looks like with the sun. The stars spread apart. This is a phenomenon known as gravitational lensing. This was confirmed in 2015 by Hubble. This is a fantastic image where in the center is a galaxy. Behind it was a supernova. And the supernova light bent and produced 4 images of itself. This is called Einstein's cross. It's fantastic. So, how does all of this relate to medicine? Well, what in medicine is our risky, what forces treatments to make risky predictions? A clinical trial. That's what a clinical trial is. It forces a risky prediction, and I'll show you exactly why. First of all, it's a direct test of a treatment, unlike laboratory evidence, which is just looking at how it responds in a test tube or an isolated system. There's randomization, which creates identical groups. This prevents confounding. There's a control group, so you can follow the natural history of the disease. There's blinding. This eliminates placebo. There's double blinding. This eliminates experimental bias. And there's oversight of the experiment. This prevents reporting bias and confabulation. And finally, there's accurate measurement, which circumvents memory fallibility. So just to continue with the topic of the history of medicine, all you have to do is look back at the last 100 years of medicine and see that there have been many theories or treatments proposed that had lots and lots of evidence from the ubiquitous evidence. In other words, anecdote, observation, had all of those totality of evidence and all that stuff. When you finally did a clinical trial, it didn't work. I'd like to give you some classic examples of this in every field so that you understand this. The first is surgery. There was a procedure in the 1930s and 40s called the internal mammary artery ligation. This was to treat angina. And you just go in and ligate the internal mammary artery. There was lots of, physiologically, it made sense to them at the time. And there was observational. Tons of surgeons, oh, when I do this, my patients do great. Their angina gets better. It has to work. It wasn't until 1960 that, published in JAMA, you have the first ever sham surgical trial, where you have a group of patients that actually get sham surgery. They pretend to actually cut in them, but they don't do anything with their artery. Obviously, that group did just as well as the group that had the real internal mammary artery ligation. This was recently done. Sham surgery was actually done with arthroscopy for degenerative medial meniscus tears, which used to be the most popular arthroscopic procedure or orthopedic procedure in the country. And these were published, a series of them, in New England Journal of Medicine. And when you actually do sham surgery for meniscal tears, there's no difference. Let's go to pharma. I think in pharma, there's too many examples to even mention, but the most notorious example of the 20th century had to be econide and flecainide. And these were antiarrhythmics, and what they do is they suppress PVCs. And we know post-MI, people get PVCs, and the people who get PVCs lead to sudden death and cardiac arrhythmias. And econide and flecainide suppress those PVCs. So you have a physiological explanation for why econide and flecainide would work. No clinical trials done. We started using it from 1980 until 1990. In 1990, the CAST trial was finally published, which showed that econide and flecainide increase death in post-MI patients, so much so that between 1980 and 1990, it's estimated that we killed about the same number of people who were dead or killed in Vietnam. Supplements. Well, if you look at supplements, the greatest theory of the 20th century is the antioxidant theory of aging. This really was. And as I went through it before, this was originally proposed, you can find his original study, Denham Harmon. He was studying the effects of ionizing radiation and free radicals, and thought that if you buffered the free radicals, you would prevent aging. This was all supported by observational evidence, ancient wisdom, and authority. You got Linus Pauling saying how antioxidants work. You have observational evidence that people eat fruits and vegetables have less heart. You've got all of it. And then we do the clinical trials, and it fails miserably. So hopefully this demonstrates the importance of clinical trials. If you do not have a clinical trial, you really can be fooled by these other forms of evidence. What I'm presenting to you here is just evidence-based medicine. I'm not telling you anything you guys don't know. And what this is, have at least one clinical trial for your supplement, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because as you guys know, clinical trials have problems. And that's a whole lecture on its own. Don't want to get into that now. So maybe many trials will be needed, but at least one. Now, what's really interesting is that evidence-based medicine, standards of evidence, are innate for pharmaceuticals. Let me give you an example. If you go to your patients and say, hey, I have a new Pfizer drug, a synthetic drug, that in a test tube reduces inflammation. Would you like to take that for your arthritis? What do you think your patients are going to say? No, am I a guinea pig? Are you serious? Has this been tried in people yet? But they're perfectly willing to take Infladox from their chiropractor. So all I'm suggesting here is that we use the same standards of evidence for supplements that we use for pharmaceuticals. I don't really see the difference. Is there a evidence-based medicine approach to supplements that you can find, resource that you can find on the internet? Well, I've been searching for years and years and years. This is called Natural Medicine's Comprehensive Database. It's a pay site. It's clunky. It fails all the time. I don't know if I agree with all their assessments, but it's the closest thing to an evidence-based medicine assessment of supplements that I could find. If any of you find anything better, please inform me. I would love to see it. Now, before I move on with evidence-based medicine, you guys have to recognize when people are not using evidence-based medicine standards. And let me give you a few to recognize, the most important ones. So the first non-evidence-based medicine standard is what I call postmodern standard of evidence. And what this is all evidence works. Anecdotes are good, ancient wisdom, it all works. Where have you guys seen this? Well, there's lots of famous doctors on TV or on the internet that propose this. Mark Hyman, Andrew Weil, Mercola, Dr. Axe, Dr. Oz. They've all been quoted as saying a anecdote to them is just as good as a clinical trial. So they have a postmodern standard of evidence. It also explains to me, well, how does Dr. Oz have an hour-long show every day of life-saving treatments? This postmodern standard of evidence. It all works. So you've got treatments all day long. Makes sense, right? And then there's entire medical philosophies that have a postmodern standard of evidence. Integrative medicine, functional medicine, chiropractic, naturopathy, all evidence is good. And to me, this explains why there's 87,000 supplements at work. Because if you have a postmodern standard of evidence, all evidence works, of course 87,000 supplements work, for sure. But my question to them is, if all 87,000 supplements work, which one do you take? You'd have to take all of them. How do they choose? I don't know. The next type of standard of evidence you'll see a lot is the unfalsifiable standard of evidence. And what happens with these people is that if you do have a good clinical trial that shows that their treatment doesn't work, they backpedal. They make what's known as an ad hoc argument, an argument on the spot. They move the goalposts. Some examples of this in the supplement world is, well, you know, the treatment didn't work on the big group, but if we had a subgroup in that study, it would have worked on them. This was used for when the fish oil and niacin studies don't work. The wrong part of the plant. When echinacea failed in the NIH trial, this is what they said. Oh, you used the wrong strain of echinacea. Or there's what's called the holism defense. In other words, you cannot see results. Patients don't get better unless you fix up the whole body. You can't just fix up one little element to their health. You have to fix up everything. Now, I'm not saying these actually may be true. A lot of these defenses, it's true, but it just makes you look a little unfalsifiable, which makes you look a little weak. My favorite type of standard of evidence is what I call the opportunistic standard of evidence. This is the best. So these people basically work backwards. Their treatment works. They're certain of it. They are tied to this one treatment. All they need to do is find evidence that it works, right? So they'll be postmodern. In other words, they'll use any type of evidence for it to work. They'll be unfalsifiable, so if there's a trial that proves them wrong, they'll move the goalposts. But here's the best part. When they have opponents that use the same type of evidence, they criticize them for it. So that's my favorite type of standard of evidence. Hopefully this is ringing some bells in some of your heads, and you're like, yeah, I've seen people like that. So step number 11 in evaluating your evidence, a lot of times you're not going to be left with a lot of evidence. You're going to have sparse evidence, as I mentioned. So in these cases, what you can do is compare with medicines that utilize similar mechanisms of action. Let me give you a few very important examples here. CoQ10. So CoQ10 has many mechanisms of action, but as far as preventing coronary artery disease, it's claimed that it does that because, why? It's a strong antioxidant. Now, have we used antioxidants in coronary artery disease and tested that hypothesis? Yes. Did it work? No, it failed miserably. Now, does this prove that CoQ10 doesn't work in preventing heart disease? No, but it certainly doesn't look that good for CoQ10. Curcumin. Now, curcumin, its mechanism of action is proposed that it blocks the inflammatory cascade, particularly interleukin-13. Now, this is only based on a couple of studies, so we don't necessarily know how curcumin works, but let's assume that it does block interleukin-13. Can any of you think of medicines that are well known to us that block the inflammatory cascade? Yes, you've got corticosteroids. You've got COX inhibitors. You've got TNF inhibitors. You've got prescription interleukin inhibitors. Do they have side effects? Of course, they have horrible side effects. Why? Well, first of all, the inflammatory cascade is tied to other systems like coagulation and other things. And you need inflammation to fight cancers and fight infections. So my question to you is, how is curcumin exempt from this physiology? Ask yourself that question. And then lastly, you may find an analog that is just so much better than your supplement. Why use it in the first place? So a great example here is, well, you have a patient who has high cholesterol. They want to take garlic. Well, it's true there's a few studies, it's a little inconsistent, that garlic lowers your cholesterol a little better. Why would you use garlic if you have a statin? Can anyone answer that? Anyway. Okay, so here we're at the end. And number 12 is your final appraisal. So let's appraise Infladox, which I started the whole lecture with. On the right side, you can see the list of ingredients there. Here's my first problem with Infladox. I have no idea how much curcumin and the rest of the ingredients the patient's getting. Now, hopefully that's a big issue for some of you, because medicine is based on the therapeutic window, right? There's a therapeutic window to every medicine. And here they're not revealing it. You don't know how many milligrams the patient's getting. The first ingredient here is curcumin. Now, as I said to you, curcumin could potentially have really bad side effects, and it has never been falsified in clinical trials. There's really no clinical trials for curcumin. And the next ingredient here, white willow bark. What is white willow bark? Dr. Schaefer can't. She knows what it is. Anyone know what white willow bark is? No? No? So white willow bark's being used in medicine for, so Hippocrates used it, and then in the 1800s, they extracted its active ingredient. It's called salicylic acid. It's aspirin, right? So white willow, so this has aspirin in it. It has salicylic acid, right? So here's my question to you. Should a healthy patient take a daily dose of unknown amounts of an interleukin inhibitor and aspirin for the purpose of exercise recovery and joint support? Are any of you comfortable doing that? Well, hopefully the answer is no. I'm certainly not comfortable with that. So my assessment of Infladox is no. So if we look at the big picture here, if you have a targeting approach, you find a single ingredient, a single testable claim, and you take a healthy patient, and you use a standard of evidence that forces risky predictions like clinical trials, and you understand the physiology, and you get rid of this false dichotomy that supplements are indeed medications. They are just like pharmaceuticals. It's very hard to find evidence that supplements are both safe and effective. Thank you. One last thing. Please try to falsify my presentation. And this is my hypothesis. If you guys find any problems with it, this is how science works. Criticize me. I'm interested.
So, I guess homeopathic medicine falls in the same category, right?
Homeopathy.
Yeah.
Well, were you here for my lecture 2 years ago when I explained what homeopathy was? I don't think you were. Okay, I'd be happy to come back and give that lecture. But no, homeopathy is not what people think it is. It is not. People think homeopathy means natural substances. It's not. Homeopathy is a interesting it's a whole medical system that was developed by Samuel Hahnemann in Germany in the late 1700s. It has two concepts. One of them is like treats like. So if someone, for instance, is itchy, you give them a little bit of poison ivy. The next philosophy of homeopathy is, or for instance, if someone has insomnia, this is true, you give them caffeine. Okay? The next point in homeopathy is the more you dilute something, the stronger it becomes. And if you really look at homeopathic dilutions, like they have this thing called C. A 12C dilution basically is like me going to Miami Beach and dumping a little caffeine in Miami Beach, coming back 1,000 years later, while all the water's mixed, and then grabbing randomly a cup of the water. How many molecules of caffeine are actually going to be there? The answer is 0, which is amazing because when you go to homeopathy, you say, you do realize it's so dilute, there's not a single active ingredient. And you know what they say? Yes, we acknowledge that. And they say, hold on, so how does this work? The water has memory. So that's homeopathy. It's very different than supplements, by the way. It's you know, supplements, it's plausible. It's plausible that curcumin may have some interesting mechanism of action and do things. All supplements in general to me are great because, as we know, we've derived so many treatments from nature. I don't really have that much of a problem. Homeopathy is not plausible. It just, if you with modern biology, physics, and chemistry, you would have to disregard everything we know about biology, physics, and chemistry for it to actually work. Anyone else have any questions?